Hey, Shabbat Shalom Israel. Today is March 30th, 2024. It is the 19th day of the first month, the 5th day of unleavened bread. But this is a special Shabbat because this Shabbat is called Ton Sabbaton. It's the first of the 7 Sabbaths, counting up to the next festival, Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks. And so we count 7 of these, and they count up to Shavuot. Now, the reason why this is important is because in the death, burial, resurrection year of Yahushua Messiah, this was the day of the resurrection of Yahushua Messiah on Ton Sabbaton in 34 CE. And this is really powerful that the sign of the everlasting covenant, the Shabbat, would be the day the Messiah would come out of the grave. The day that he did most of his miracles would be the day he came out of the grave. And there's a prophecy in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, verse 30, which tells us that in the last days, that when we turn back to Yahuwah, this word turn back is literally spelled like Shabbat. When we Shabbat to Yahuwah and obey his voice, that the blessings that are in the Torah would come upon us, that he would restore us again. And so I believe in these last days, a big part of returning to Shabbat is understanding this mystery, this secret that actually the Messiah rose from the grave on Shabbat, but not any Shabbat, the first of 7, counting up to Shavuot. And this is key for understanding the appointed times of Yah. It's key for understanding his ways and his cycles. And for a lot of people, they may not even realize this in the mainstream. For example, this weekend, a lot of people, the whole Good Friday to Easter Sunday, the word Easter doesn't even show up in the scriptures. And a lot of people don't know this. Now, the King James tried to slip it in there in Acts 12, verse 4, but a lot of other translations have corrected that error. Even the New King James has corrected that error as well. But 29 times the word Passover shows up in the scripture. And Paul even tells us that we should do this in remembrance. He's quoting Messiah, by the way. Do this in remembrance of me. That Messiah in Luke chapter 22 talks about, the bread and the wine, that the renewing of the covenant in that Passover meal. Paul quotes that in 1 Corinthians 11, that when we partake of what a lot of people know as communion, which is aka Passover, that we're doing this in remembrance of Messiah. As often as we do this, we are proclaiming Messiah's death. And the reason why that's important is because it's through Messiah's death that it demonstrates his love towards us and the Father's love towards us. So Elohim so loved the world that he gave his only begotten or special son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. So this is key. Also in 1 Corinthians 5, 7 and 8, it tells us to keep the feast. Paul instructs the Corinthians to keep the feast. We need to get the leaven out. So a lot of people aren't aware of these cycles and the Moedim that are even in the New Testament, but the important thing is to realize the Messiah actually rose from the grave. The most powerful event in human history, the resurrection of Yahushua Messiah, happened on the Shabbat, and that's really powerful. So what I wanted to do, I wanted to share some insight about this, and the reason why I'm saying this is that all the Greek and all the other languages literally tell us that Messiah rose on the Shabbat. And just recently, in the last 100 years, a lot of this information has been lost. But if you go back and you study every single language, you're going to find out the Messiah actually rose on Shabbat. So I'd like to share something with you. This is from the Concordant Literal New Testament version. And it is interesting because the way they translate this can be it's quite different than a lot of translations. They do it literally from the Greek. I just wanted to point out the end of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and just a few other things just real quickly here. At the lighting up into one of the Sabbaths, here's that one of the Sabbaths, remember there's 7 in the account of Shavuot, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to behold the sepulchre. So we see that's on one of the Sabbaths. And also, let me just go to Mark here. Mark 16. And let get a little bit closer. And very early in the morning on one of the Sabbaths, they are coming to the tomb at the rising of the sun. And if we skip down to verse 9, now rising in the morning, in the first Sabbath, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. Again, the first of the Sabbaths, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. A lot of people don't realize that the scripture literally says Ton Sabbaton in the Greek. And if you translate that literally, it's the first of the Sabbaths, or one of the Sabbaths. Also, in the book of Luke, we see this. Let me just show this real quick. Now, in the early depths of one of the Sabbaths, they and certain others together with them came to the tomb, bringing the spices which they make ready. And also in the book of John, now on one of the Sabbaths, Miriam Magdalene is coming to the tomb in the morning, there being still darkness, and is observing the stone taken away from the door of the tomb. She is racing then, and is coming to Simon Peter and to the other disciples to whom Yahusha was fond, and she is saying to them, they take away the master out of the tomb, and we are not aware where they place him. So again, we see this throughout. And actually, if I drop down in verse 19, it being then the evening of that day, one of the Sabbaths, that the doors having been locked, where the disciples gathered together because of the fear of the Jews, that Yahusha came and stood in the midst and is saying to them, peace to you. Again, I always want to point out one of the Sabbaths. Again, it's all throughout. Now, some people may say, well, in the book of Acts, in Acts 20, the early disciples met on the first day of the week to break bread, but that's actually not the case. When we look at this, it's actually fascinating. We know that in Acts 15, when they got the instructions, when new believers, those of the Gentiles were coming in, they were given 4 things to do. And a lot of people miss out on Acts 15:21, where it says this, for Moses, from ancient generations, get this, city by city has those who are heralding him being read on every Sabbath in the synagogues. In other words, Moses is being taught. So even though they gave those 4 things, it wasn't going to be that they're going to learn more in the progression of time. So they weren't throwing a whole bunch of stuff on them when they were starting off, that they could learn, and from faith to faith, to esteem, they could grow in their faith. And so, in Acts 20 verse 7, now on one of the Sabbaths, at our having gathered to break bread, Paul argued with them being about to be off on the morrow, besides he prolonged the word until midnight. Now we know the rest of the story. Someone falls out of the upper room there, but the point being that it was one of the Sabbaths. The whole context here is also Pentecost. If you read this, and then the other one more. I'm gonna just is in 1 Corinthians 16. On one of the Sabbaths, let each of you lay aside by himself in store that in which he should be prospered, that no collection may be occurring then whenever I may come. And this is in context to verse 9 here, where it says, and yet I shall stay in Ephesus until Pentecost. So a lot of people don't realize this, but one of the Sabbaths is in context to Pentecost. So this all makes sense. This whole book is actually written in light of the appointed times. As a matter of fact, the whole Bible is written in light of Yah's appointed times. So my point is this, that in these last days, this great mystery of Messiah's resurrection took place on Sabbath. And today is the anniversary of Ton Sabbaton. Now, the day, the third day of unleavened bread, doesn't match up this year like it did in 34 CE, but nevertheless, the day of that first Sabbath, today is that kind of anniversary of remembering Messiah coming out of the grave. And this is really where our hope lies. The fact that Messiah came out of that grave, it's hope that one day those who are in the grave will come out of the grave, and those who are still on the earth will be transformed. And so the Sabbath is all about entering his rest. And when we rest in him, we will see the power of Elohim displayed like in Yahushua's resurrection in 34 CE. So I'll be sharing more about this later, but Shabbat Shalom, and may you rest in him.